At 3:03 in the morning, the house knocked 3 times from beneath the floor, and Sarah Mitchell knew before the sound ended that something inside her new home was awake. On the first night, she told herself the sound came from old pipes. David said the same thing, and believing him was easier than admitting that the house still felt occupied by someone else's life. Moving boxes stood in uneven towers along the walls. The room smelled faintly of dust, cedar, and the sweet floral cleaner the previous owner's family had used before the sale. 6 weeks earlier, Sarah and David had made the decision to buy the place in less than 15 minutes. Their real estate agent had praised the original floors, the deep porch, and the 4 bedrooms. She had called it a farmhouse, though the oldest records described it as a cape that had been expanded 1 room at a time. It sat 20 minutes outside Portland, Maine, and the price was low enough to make Sarah suspicious. The explanation was probate. The most recent owner had died, the estate had taken nearly 2 years to settle, and the house had remained empty while lawyers and relatives argued over it. That sounded ordinary enough. Sarah had stopped asking questions when she saw the kitchen's white farmhouse sink. Emily had stopped listening as soon as she found the small first-floor bedroom at the back of the house, the one with a built-in window seat overlooking the maple trees. She claimed it before either parent could object. Emily was 8, and she had opinions about nearly everything. At dinner on their second night, she announced that someone lived underneath her floor. David laughed, not cruelly, but with the tired affection of a father whose child had just said something absurd. He asked what the person looked like. Emily went still. Sarah's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "She doesn't look like anything," Emily said. "She only knocks." Then, after a moment, she added, "She wants me to knock back." Sarah told herself that children absorbed the mood of a house the way sponges absorbed water. New rooms creaked. Old boards shifted. The unfamiliar became a story because a story was easier for a child to understand. Then random noise. Sarah believed that explanation until 3:03 that night, when she woke from a dead sleep with her heart pounding. 3 knocks sounded from somewhere beneath the rear half of the house. A pause followed, exactly as long as a held breath. Then came 3 more. It was not a radiator ticking or wood settling after a warm day. Homeowners learned the vocabulary of a house quickly, and this sound did not belong to any ordinary language of pipes, gutters, or old beams. It had rhythm. It had patience. It sounded intentional. David slept through it. Sarah lay beside him with her eyes open, counting her pulse and waiting for a third set. She promised herself that if the sound did not return, she would blame a bad dream and Emily's imagination. It did not return that night. It returned the next night at exactly 3:03. This time David sat upright and whispered, "What is that?" Sarah did not answer. She did not have one, and some old animal part of her did not want one. In the morning, over coffee either of them really wanted, David listed practical possibilities with the calm authority of a man who repaired commercial buildings for a living. Water hammer. A loose gutter. A branch striking the siding. A raccoon in the crawlspace. Every explanation was reasonable. None survived a careful inspection. The gutters were secure. The branches were too far from the house. There were no tracks near the crawlspace vents, and no animal droppings under the foundation. Sarah did not point out that raccoons did not wait until 3:03 and knock in groups of 3. She did not want to become the wife who turned a house noise into a ghost story before they had unpacked the dishes. Across the street, an old man named Frank Cooper watched the moving truck leave with a mug cooling between his hands. Sarah could not read his expression. It might have been pity. It might have been recognition. He did not introduce himself during their first week, or their second. He simply watched the house with the patience of someone who had seen the same storm form before. When Sarah finally waved to him from the driveway one Saturday morning, he lifted his mug in reply and said nothing. Somehow, his silence felt heavier than a warning. On the third night, Sarah tried to record the sound on her phone. She placed it face down on the floor outside Emily's room and left the voice memo running. At 3:03, the knocks came exactly as expected. Yet when she listened the next morning, the recording contained only the soft rush of the heating system and David turning in bed. The waveform remained almost flat during the moments when Sarah remembered the sound shaking through the floor. David suggested that low frequencies sometimes failed to register clearly on a phone microphone. Sarah accepted the explanation until Emily wandered into the kitchen and asked why the woman under the floor did not like being recorded. Neither Sarah nor David had told her about the phone. Later that day, David opened every accessible section of the crawlspace and found nothing but old wiring, insulation, and the dry tracks of insects in the dust. He placed a motion-activated camera near the rear foundation wall. For 2 nights it recorded nothing. On the third, the camera stopped at 3:02 and restarted at 3:04. The missing 2 minutes did not appear as corrupted footage. According to the timestamp, they had simply never existed. The knocking did not stop. It settled into their lives the way a stray cat settles into a yard, appearing at the same hour with the same quiet insistence until surprise became a more permanent kind of fear. By the second week, Sarah kept a notebook on her nightstand. She recorded the time, the number of knocks, the weather, and anything unusual she had noticed. Writing it down made the pattern feel measurable, and measurable things were supposed to be less frightening. The entries proved the opposite. For 6 nights, the sound came at 3:03. On the 7th, it came at 2:47. 2 nights later, it came shortly after midnight. It always began with 3 knocks, paused, then repeated. Emily stopped mentioning it at dinner. Sarah first took that as a good sign. Then she realized her daughter had simply learned that certain true things made adults uncomfortable. Instead of talking about the knocking to her parents, Emily began talking to the floor. One evening, Sarah stood outside the child's bedroom holding a laundry basket and heard Emily's voice through the door. It was soft and conversational. "What's your name?" she asked. A pause. "Are you cold down there?" Another pause. "I can sing if you want." Sarah remained frozen in the hallway. She could hear no answer, but Emily waited each time as though someone had replied. When Sarah entered, Emily was sitting cross-legged near the bed with one palm resting on the floorboards. She looked up without guilt or surprise. Sarah asked who she had been speaking to. "The girl underneath," Emily said. "She says she forgot the sun." That night Sarah moved a chair into Emily's room and stayed until the child fell asleep. At 3:03, the knocking came from beneath the floor. Emily did not wake, but her fingers tapped 3 times against the blanket. Sarah began testing small rules. She moved Emily's bed away from the wall. The knocking shifted with it. She placed a heavy rug over the boards. The sound became softer but no less distinct. One night she slept on the floor beside the bed and felt each knock travel through her ribs, although David, standing in the doorway, heard it coming from the wall behind him. The house seemed to place the sound wherever fear would make it most convincing. Emily claimed the person below did not always speak. Sometimes it sent pictures into her mind: a narrow room, a yellow lantern, a woman singing with tears on her face. Sarah asked what song the woman sang. Emily hummed 4 notes from a lullaby Sarah did not recognize. Days later, when Sarah opened Rebecca's box, she found those same 4 notes written in pencil above the lyrics of an old children's song. That was the moment coincidence stopped feeling like a serious explanation. 2 days later, while clearing the garage, Sarah noticed a narrow seam behind a stack of warped shelving. One panel of the wall had been fastened with screws that were newer than the surrounding wood. David removed it, expecting to find an old electrical junction or evidence of mice. Instead, they found a shallow storage cavity between the studs. Inside sat a cardboard box wrapped in brittle plastic. The box had not belonged to the owner whose estate they had purchased. The top was marked with a faded name, Rebecca Hale. David wanted to set it aside and call the estate attorney. Sarah agreed, but neither of them called that day. They were busy, and the name meant nothing to them yet. What Sarah knew was that the knocking had begun to creep into the evening. It came at 10, then 9, then 8:15 while she and David were watching television in the family room beside Emily's bedroom. The sound rose through the floor near the hallway. David muted the television. 3 knocks. Silence. 3 more. For the first time since they had moved in, his face shifted from irritation to unease. "That isn't plumbing," he said. Either of them slept well. Around midnight, Sarah went to the kitchen for water and saw a light across the street. Frank Cooper sat near his front window, staring toward their house. His presence made her feel less alone and more watched at the same time. 2 days later, she crossed the street with a plate of store-bought cookies as an excuse. Frank opened the door before she knocked. He invited her inside without surprise, as if he had been waiting for the visit to arrive on its own schedule. He was in his late 70s, thin and sharp-eyed, with the careful manner of a man who had learned that saying too much could create obligations. Sarah asked about the history of her house. She mentioned the name Rebecca Hale. Frank's hands tightened around his coffee mug. He explained that Rebecca and her son had not been the most recent owners. They had lived there 20 years earlier, long before the elderly man whose estate Sarah and David had bought. Several families had come and gone in between. Most had stayed only a few years. None had children who slept in the rear bedroom. "What happened to Rebecca?" Sarah asked. Frank looked through his window at the Mitchell house. "Her boy disappeared," he said. "After that, she disappeared too." He told Sarah that Daniel Hale had been 7 years old. One week he was riding his bike along the road and building forts near the tree line. The next, Rebecca said he was sick and needed rest. A few weeks later, police cars arrived. Daniel was reported missing. There were searches, interviews, and volunteers moving through the woods. No one found him. Frank said the house went dark soon afterward. No moving truck came. Rebecca left with a single suitcase, and the property eventually passed through foreclosure before being sold. When Sarah asked whether he believed Rebecca had harmed her son, Frank looked offended by the question. "No," he said. "I think she was terrified of something. I just never knew what." Sarah returned home with Rebecca's name sitting heavily in her mind. That night, she searched local newspaper archives. The first result was 28 years old. The headline read, "Missing 7-year-old Daniel Hale last seen at family home." Beneath it was a school photograph of a boy with a gap-toothed smile and a striped shirt. Sarah stared at the address until the numbers blurred. The article contained few details. Authorities had questioned Daniel's mother. There were no signs of forced entry, no witnesses, and no ransom demand. Search teams had covered the woods and drainage ditches for miles. The case did not fit the shape of an ordinary abduction, but it did not fit an accident either. Sarah read every article she could find. Each was shorter than the one before it. Public attention faded. The final update, published months later, said Rebecca Hale had left the area and that her son's case remained open but inactive. Sarah closed the laptop and listened to the refrigerator hum. She waited for the knocking, though she would not admit that was what she was doing. It did not come. The silence was worse. At 1 a.m, Sarah returned to the garage. She carried the hidden box to the kitchen and cut away the brittle plastic. Inside were folded sweaters, a hairbrush, unopened envelopes, several children's drawings, and a spiral notebook held shut with a rubber band that crumbled when she touched it. The first pages contained the ordinary record of an ordinary life. Daniel's school play. A recipe for banana bread. A complaint about a leaking faucet. Then the entries changed. Daniel says someone is under his floor again. I told him houses make noise, but tonight I heard it too. 3 knocks, then silence, then 3 more. I cannot explain the feeling except that it seemed to be asking permission. Sarah read on. Daniel is not sleeping. He says the person asks him to answer. Daniel says it sounds like a little girl, but sometimes it sounds like me. A later entry was pressed so hard into the page that the pen had torn the paper. It knows his name now. He swears he never told it. Then I made him promise not to knock back, but he did it in his sleep. 3 times. The entries became shorter and more frantic. It does not want to be rescued. It wants to be invited. It learns a child by listening, and once it can copy a voice, it uses that voice to call from another room. Sarah's skin prickled. She remembered Emily speaking to the floor and pausing for answers no one else could hear. Near the end, Rebecca wrote that iron nails around Daniel's bed had quieted the sound for one night. The next night, the knocking moved into the wall. Salt across the doorway had done nothing. A running fan had masked the sound but had not stopped Daniel from hearing it. The final complete entry filled most of a page in jagged handwriting. I understand now why it chose this room. It has done this before. It waits for a child to answer until the child no longer knows which voice belongs to the living. I will not let it take him. I have made a place where it cannot hear him, and I have found a way to get him out. After that, dozens of pages were blank. Sarah sat at the table until gray morning light entered the kitchen. She was no longer asking what made the knocking. She was asking what Rebecca had built, how she had hidden her son, and whether the thing beneath the house had mistaken Emily for another chance. Sarah reread the notebook with a ruler and a magnifying glass, searching the torn edges and the impressions left on blank pages. By shading one page lightly with the side of a pencil, she uncovered words Rebecca had written on the sheet above it before tearing that sheet away. Do not let it hear fear in your voice. Another impression appeared farther down. 3 answers make a door. Sarah did not know whether Rebecca meant 3 spoken replies, 3 return knocks, or 3 nights of contact. Emily had already done all of those things. Sarah's own notebook showed that the sound grew earlier only after the night Emily's fingers tapped against the blanket. The pattern did not prove a rule, but it suggested escalation. The presence was no longer waiting until the house slept. It was learning when the family gathered, when Emily was alone, and which voice would make Sarah cross a room without thinking. From then on, Sarah and David agreed on a simple safety plan. Neither would answer a call from another room without first seeing the person. They chose a private phrase Emily could use on the phone. They kept the child's bedroom door open, and David installed a temporary floor alarm that would chime if the boards near the bed moved. The precautions felt ridiculous in daylight. After dark, they felt inadequate. When David came downstairs, he found Sarah with the notebook beneath one hand. He did not ask whether something was wrong. He looked as if he were bracing for the answer. She told him about Daniel, the news reports, and Rebecca's entries. David read the final pages twice. Then he said the words Sarah had been avoiding. "We should leave." Sarah wanted to agree. Fear told her to pack the car, wake Emily, and never return. Another instinct pushed back. Leaving without understanding the pattern might not protect their daughter. Emily had already answered. The notebook suggested that the thing learned voices and followed attention, not property lines. Sarah could not know whether distance would break that connection. She also could not bear the thought of abandoning the house without warning and allowing another family to repeat the same mistake. Over the next few days, she stayed close to Emily. She walked her to the school bus instead of watching from the porch. She sat beside the child's bed at night. She kept Rebecca's notebook on her lap and listened for changes in the sound. Emily seemed less frightened than before, which frightened Sarah more. One evening, while brushing her hair, Emily said the person beneath the floor was tired. "She wants to go outside," Emily explained. "She says she hasn't seen the sky in a long time." Sarah asked whether the person had a name. Emily hesitated. For a moment, her expression looked much older than 8. "Daniel," she whispered. Sarah's hand stopped. "You said it was a girl?" Emily shrugged. "Sometimes it is. Sometimes it isn't. Daniel says his mother used to sing to him under the floor. He wants you to sing too." Sarah did not sleep in her own room again that week. David spent the following evening inspecting the crawlspace. The access hatch was in a utility closet near the rear of the house. The crawlspace was low but dry, with packed earth beneath a plastic moisture barrier and stone foundation walls around the older section. Beneath Emily's room, he found joists reinforced with lumber that did not match the rest of the structure. The boards were old but clearly newer than the original house. A narrow section had been framed between 2 foundation supports, then concealed behind removable panels stained to match the surrounding wood. Rusted iron nails had been driven at regular intervals around the frame. A small metal vent pipe ran from the enclosed space to an exterior foundation grate. Someone had not improvised the structure in panic. Someone had planned it. David came upstairs with dirt on his sleeves and a tremor in his hands. "There's a room under her room," he said. "Not a grave. A room." They agreed not to open it while Emily was home. On Saturday morning, Sarah packed an overnight bag and drove her daughter to a friend's house 2 streets away. She called the friend's mother privately and asked her not to let Emily walk home alone, no matter what excuse Emily gave. As Emily climbed out of the car, she turned back. "I need to say goodbye to Daniel first." Sarah tightened her grip on the steering wheel. "You can say goodbye later," she said. Emily looked past her toward the direction of their house. "He says later is when people make mistakes." Then she closed the door. Frank Cooper arrived at the Mitchells' porch less than an hour after Sarah returned. He wore a heavy coat despite the mild October morning. He said he had seen Emily leave and guessed what Sarah and David intended to do. "I let Rebecca face it alone," he said. "I won't do that twice." At the kitchen table, he told them what he had withheld. During the weeks before Daniel was reported missing, Frank had seen Rebecca digging near the crawlspace access after dark. She carried lumber inside. She bought bags of rock salt and boxes of iron nails from a hardware store in town. Frank had assumed she was repairing the foundation. Then Daniel stopped appearing outside. Rebecca said he was ill. Frank accepted the answer because it was easier than prying. The last time he spoke to her, she looked exhausted but strangely calm. She told him Daniel was safe. She also said that if anyone ever heard knocking in that house, they must never answer with a voice, a name, or a matching rhythm. Frank thought grief had broken something in her. A week later she was gone. "Why didn't you tell the police?" David asked. Frank stared into his untouched coffee. "I told them about the lumber. I told them Daniel had stopped coming outside. They searched the house." His voice dropped. "They never found the room. And I never told them about the knocking because I was afraid they would stop listening to everything else." David entered the crawlspace with a headlamp, a pry bar, gloves, and a respirator. Sarah remained near the open utility closet, holding Rebecca's notebook. Each crack of wood below made the house feel as if it were flinching. After several minutes, David called her name. His voice was tight, but not panicked. Sarah crawled down after him. The concealed chamber was roughly 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and high enough for a child to sit upright. It was dry. A decayed sleeping bag lay against one wall. Beside it were children's books, empty glass water bottles, a rusted battery lantern, and a covered metal pail. A thin tube connected the chamber to the exterior vent. Drawings had been taped to the boards. Most showed a boy and a dark-haired woman beneath an enormous yellow sun. One showed a black shape under a house, surrounded by rows of small white teeth that might also have been windows. Iron nails lined the frame from the inside, their heads rubbed bright long. A go-by repeated touch. Near the sleeping bag, words had been carved into a support beam in careful block letters. "Daniel was here. MOM got me out." Sarah read the sentence twice. This was not a grave. It was a shelter. Rebecca had hidden her son close to the source of the sound, but she had also tried to isolate him from it. The packed books, water, ventilation, and iron boundaries suggested a temporary refuge while she arranged an escape no one else could be allowed to understand. Daniel had not vanished inside the house. He had survived long enough to leave a message. David reached for one of the drawings. Before his fingers touched it, 3 knocks sounded from the far side of the chamber wall. Sarah stopped breathing. The sound did not come from below them. It came from inside the stone foundation. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more. David backed toward the opening. Then, from the utility closet above them, Emily's voice called, "Mom?" Sarah's body reacted before her mind did. She turned toward the hatch. David caught her arm. Emily was 2 streets away. Sarah's phone began vibrating in her pocket at the same moment. The caller ID showed the name of Emily's friend's mother. Sarah answered without speaking. Emily's real voice came through the phone, small and frightened. "Mom, Daniel is here," she whispered. Sarah looked at David. Above them, the false Emily called again, closer to the open hatch. "Mom, answer me." Sarah pressed the phone to her ear. "Do not say my name," she told her daughter. "Do not answer any knocking. Stay with Mrs. Parker. I'm coming to you." On the line, Emily began to cry. "It says you opened the door." The light in David's headlamp flickered. From inside the chamber wall came a slow dragging sound, as if something were moving one careful hand across the stone. Sarah and David climbed out without touching anything else. David pulled the crawlspace hatch shut, and Sarah slid the utility closet's heavy storage cabinet in front of it. The knocking followed them through the floor, not frantic or angry, but almost pleased. They left through the front door and did not return that night. Sarah and David picked up Emily, checked into a hotel near Portland, and kept every light in the room on until morning. Emily slept between them. In the hotel, the rules of ordinary life returned slowly. Doors opened into hallways, not hidden rooms. Pipes made random sounds. Elevators arrived with a bell. Even so, Sarah found herself checking every noise for rhythm. Around 2 a.m, Emily admitted that the false Daniel had first spoken to her on the day they moved in. It had not begun by asking to be released. It had asked simple questions a lonely child might answer: whether she liked the room, whether she missed her old school, whether her parents argued when they thought she was asleep. It had learned what comfort sounded like by repeating Emily's own thoughts back to her. Only later did it claim to be trapped. Only after Emily trusted it did it use Daniel's name. Sarah asked why Emily had never told them. "Because it said grown-ups make children leave houses when they tell the truth," Emily whispered. Sarah held her until she fell asleep, shaken by how precisely the thing had understood both children and parents. Just before dawn, she woke and said she could no longer hear Daniel. Sarah asked whether she meant the boy. Emily shook her head. "It wasn't Daniel," she said. "It only knew his name." That afternoon, David contacted a structural engineer, a foundation contractor, and the county sheriff's office. He did not describe a supernatural presence. He reported a concealed child-sized chamber connected to a decades-old missing person case. Detectives photographed the space, collected the notebook, and reopened Daniel Hale's file. No human remains were found. There was no evidence that anyone had occupied the chamber recently. A forensic examiner confirmed that the carved message and the children's drawings were decades old, but none of it proved where Daniel had gone. Frank gave another statement. This time he included everything, even the knocking. Sarah searched for Rebecca for weeks. She eventually found a death notice under the name Rebecca Hale Morgan in New Hampshire. It was 9 years old. The notice mentioned a surviving son named Daniel Morgan, but offered no photograph and no location. The detective assigned to the reopened case would not confirm whether the man was Daniel Hale. He only told Sarah that they had reason to believe the missing child might have lived beyond the date of his disappearance. It was not a complete answer, but it was enough. Rebecca had done what she wrote she would do. She had gotten her son out. Whatever used his name had remained behind. The Mitchells never slept in the house again. Under David's supervision, contractors removed the concealed chamber and filled the void beneath Emily's room with reinforced concrete. The work crews reported no strange sounds. Sarah did not feel relieved. Rebecca's notebook had made one thing clear: walls, salt, iron, and noise could interrupt the pattern, but none had destroyed its source. The family rented an apartment across town while deciding what to do. For several months, Emily woke at 3:03 and listened. She never heard the knocking again. Slowly, she stopped asking about Daniel. Sarah did not. They sold the house the following spring at a loss. They disclosed the hidden chamber, the structural work, and the connection to the old missing person investigation. They could not legally disclose a haunting they could not prove, but Sarah told the Byers that no child should sleep in the rear bedroom. The Byers were a quiet couple in their 50s with no children, and they planned to use the room as an office. They listened politely, accepted copies of the inspection reports, and said old houses collected strange stories. Sarah recognized the phrase for what it was, the kind of sentence people used when they wanted to feel reasonable. Months later, in their new home, Sarah woke at 3:03 to the sound of rain against the window. She lay still, waiting for the second sound her body had learned to expect. None came. Then her phone lit on the nightstand. It was a message from Frank Cooper. He had sent no words, only an 11-second audio recording. Sarah pressed play. At first she heard wind and the faint hiss of traffic. Then came 3 knocks, distant but clear. A pause. 3 more. Before the recording ended, a child's voice whispered from somewhere near Frank's porch. "Is Emily there?" Sarah deleted the file, then restored it from the trash because proof felt safer than memory. She never played it again. She understood now that some things were not solved. They were interrupted. They waited beneath concrete, inside walls, and behind familiar voices until someone answered in the right rhythm. And somewhere in the dark of the house they had left behind, something patient still remembered her daughter's name.